In the frigid, unforgiving wilderness of the Ural Mountains, a chilling mystery unfolded that has haunted investigators for over 6 decades. In February of 1959, a group of experienced hikers embarked on what should have been an exhilarating trek through the snowy peaks, only to meet with a series of inexplicable and terrifying events. When the search party finally reached their tent on the desolate slopes, they uncovered a scene of chaos and despair. Slashed from the inside, the abandoned campsite bore gruesome signs of a desperate struggle against an unknown force. Hi folks, I'm Johnny and welcome to The Oddest. What malevolent entity could have driven those adventurers to flee their sheltered encampment into the frozen night, leaving them scattered across the unforgiving landscape, their bodies ravaged and contorted by unimaginable forces? The haunting Dyatlov Pass incident stands as one of the most baffling unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. So sit back, relax, grab your cup of tea and join me as we delve into the mystery of the Dyatlov Pass. The sheer mystery behind what actually happened to those 9 experienced mountain hikers is part of what makes this dark and terrifying incident so intriguing. Researchers and historians still can't agree if it was a UFO case or something else entirely. These events occurred in early 1959 during the brutal winter in the Ural Mountains up in the far northern reaches of what was then the Soviet Union. Nobody can say for sure what actually happened in those final moments or what led to their deaths. Experienced hikers suddenly bouncing out of their tent, some even without shoes, and most of them without any warm clothing. They just left it all behind. But here is where we come to just the first of many bizarre facts about this case. The tent was sliced open from the inside. So whatever was going on, they were so terrified that they had to cut their way out of their tents to escape. The only clues that we've got are from diary entries that they left behind, which were found later on. However, these diary entries stop approximately 24 hours prior to what is believed to have been some terrifying and bizarre event in the sub-zero, dark and inhospitable conditions of a mountain range rather ominously known by the locals as Dead Mountain or Mountain of the Dead. Their bodies would be discovered buried under the snow in 2 separate locations. One group several weeks after disappearing, and the other group nearly 3 months later. Right after the eerie discoveries, the authorities swooped in to tightly control all of the information. There are still many lingering questions about the details that some think are still kept secret even to this day. So, on the morning of January 27th back in 1959, a group of 10 hikers were making last-minute preparations for their trip into the Ural Mountains. The leader of the group was Igor Alexeyevich Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, which is now called the Ural Federal University. He was in charge of organising this expedition as the team geared up to depart from Vizhai, the northernmost inhabited area in northern Russia. Their mission was to trek to Otorten Mountain and then make it back safely. The group consisted of 8 men and 2 women, including Dyatlov, all of whom were experienced hikers with a Grade 2 certification. This hike would pass all of them for their Grade 3 certification, essentially making them as qualified and experienced as was possible for that time. Most of the group were also students at the same university, with 38-year-old Alexander Zolotaryov being the exception, although he was a staff member and alumni of the school. So the rest of the group would consist of 24-year-old Alexander Kolevatov, 22-year-old Zenaida Kolmogorova, 21-year-old Yuri Doroshenko, 20-year-old Ludmila Dubinina, along with Georgy Krivonashenko, Rostam Slobodin and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, all 23 years old. When it comes to luck, circumstance or maybe even fate, the 10th and final member of the group was a 21-year-old called Yuri Yudin. He started the journey with the team, but he fell ill shortly afterwards. So within a 24-hour period on January 28th, he had to turn back and abandon the entire excursion. Looking back on this, it's pretty clear that his illness likely saved his life, something that I'm sure Yuri probably mulled over countless times in the months and years following the eerie events of that winter in 1959. Yuri would live to be 75, eventually passing away on the 27th of April of 2013. The first couple of days of the hike seemed to be going according to plan. Dyatlov had made arrangements with their families and the university authorities that once they had got back to Vizhai, they would send a telegram to let everyone know that they were safe and well. The folks back home, well, they figured, even with a few minor delays, they would receive this telegram no later than February 12th. By January the 31st, it seemed like the team of 9 had made it to the highland area, but their next challenge loomed ahead. So they had to climb even higher to reach their destination on the other side of the pass. Instead of lugging all of their supplies, they decided to stash some of their food and gear in a wooded area just off the route. The next day, it seemed like everything was on track as planned, as the group made their way through the pass. However, a fierce blizzard suddenly swept in, causing them to lose their way a little bit. They ended up far west of where they intended to be. Instead of scaling the pass as they had planned, they found themselves ascending Kholat Syekh. Interestingly, the local Mansi tribe call this part of the mountain Mountain of the Dead, which is steeped in local legends and folklore. It seems that they quickly realised their mistake, but the weather was deteriorating so rapidly that pushing forward was simply out of the question. They had no choice at this point but to set up camp right there and ride out the storm until the morning. And that's where the last concrete details of the group's journey end. After the evening of the 1st of February, everything becomes speculation and theory, pieced together from later discoveries. The anticipated return date of February 12th, well, that passed without any word from the group. Families held out hope though for another week. Then, on the 20th of February, they insisted, against the Hikers Institute's objections, on organising a search themselves. This little search party consisted of volunteers, mostly students and teachers. However, it quickly became evident that this group would struggle to make much progress, and it would take a long time to cover a large amount of ground effectively. Several days later, the Soviet military would conduct an official and widespread search of the area. The Air Force also covered huge areas of snowy mountain ranges with helicopters and search and recovery planes. Several more days passed. Then, the first of 2 chilling and gut-wrenching discoveries would come. On the 26th of February, a battered and torn tent was found. The campsite presented a strange and mysterious sight. Most of the hikers' belongings, including their clothes and even shoes, were all still there. It seemed like the hikers had left barefoot and not fully dressed from wherever they were. Even more alarming though was the state of the tent's ruins. Most specifically, the tent had the appearance that it was cut from the inside. It seemed that the hikers were desperate just to cut themselves out. So desperate to leave, it would seem, that they left their clothes and shoes behind, despite the blizzard-like conditions. Then there was the footprints. These footprints told a puzzling story. Both shoed feet and barefoot prints, likely from the same person, were visible. Then, suddenly, they just seemed to stop in the middle of the snow, just a short distance away. All around them, the snow was undisturbed, as if they had vanished into thin air. They seemed to have been heading towards the woodland at the edge of the campsite, and it was there that 5 of the hikers' bodies would then be found. The first 2 bodies belonged to Krivonashenko and Doroshenko. They were discovered beneath a Siberian pine tree right on the edge of the woodland. The branches on the tree were broken up to 5 metres high, suggesting that at least one of the group had tried to climb up to look for something, maybe the camp, or maybe they were trying to get away from something else. There were also remnants of a small fire near to the 2 bodies. As grim as the first 2 discoveries were, the findings of the next 3 bodies, those of the group's leader Igor Dyatlov, along with Zeneda Kolmogorova and Rustam Slobodin, well, they were equally as mysterious. The positioning of all 3 corpses indicated that they were making their way back towards the makeshift camp away from the tree, and it appeared as if they had almost frozen instantly. Investigators would go on to say that the cause of death here was hypothermia, but then that leads us to a strange question. Why then was Doroshenko's skin discoloured a brownish purple? Why did he have some kind of grey foam or liquid coming from his mouth? Why did Krivonashenko have blackened fingers and 3rd-degree burns across his shins and feet? And, more disturbingly than that, in his mouth they uncovered a chunk of flesh that he had bitten clean off his own right hand. So, over 2 months after the discovery of the first group, came the discovery of the remaining hikers. This find occurred on the 4th of May 1959, buried under over 12 feet of snow in a ravine and over 80 yards away from the location of the first 5 hikers' bodies. What was immediately apparent here was that these last 4 remaining hikers were substantially better dressed than the first 5. In fact, all 4 of them were practically fully dressed. Perhaps even stranger still, some of them were dressed in clothes and wearing shoes that had belonged to their fellow hikers who died near that cedar tree. For example, Zolotaryov was discovered wearing Dubinina's fake fur coat and hat. Perhaps even stranger, Dubinina had wrapped her foot in a piece of Krivonashenko's woolen pants. How long after the first group of hikers did these 4 meet their end? Were they moved to the ravine and then buried, or did they make their own way there, huddling up in a desperate attempt to try and get warm? Might they have been present at the tree location where their fellow hikers died? Does this explain then why some of them were wearing their clothing and shoes? I mean, that would make sense, right? I mean, they probably simply passed away first, leaving the surviving members of the group with a grim, horrible, but really needed opportunity to increase their chances of remaining alive. What's really intriguing is that when the inquests began into the deaths of the first 5 hikers found at the end of February, well, they were swiftly concluded, perhaps suspiciously so. As I mentioned earlier, the verdict was that they had likely died of hypothermia. However, the inquest into the remaining 4 hikers, that wouldn't be as straightforward. The official inquests into the deaths of the last hikers uncovered some truly bizarre and terrifying injuries. They found that all 4 had injuries resembling those of someone having been struck by a high-speed truck. Despite severe chest fractures and skull damage, there was actually no external injuries. Certainly nothing consistent with the severe internal injuries that each of them appeared to have suffered. The report even suggested that the internal injuries were indicative of someone who had been subjected to high levels of pressure. We're going to come back to this point a little bit later on. Some members of the second group had incredibly puzzling injuries. For instance, Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, and even part of her lips. What's more, these injuries seem to have been inflicted with surgical precision. Fragments of skull bone and facial tissue appear to have been removed, again with medical precision. Zolotaryov was also missing his eyeballs. Kolvatov was missing both of his eyebrows. Additionally, there was evidence of skin maceration on Dubinina's hands. Officially, the inquest attributed Dubinina's strange injuries to the putrefaction process, as she was found face down in that ravine. However, some researchers remained completely unconvinced by this explanation. Another intriguing detail that was overlooked is that 2 of the hikers' clothing contained significant levels of radiation. I mean, see, in spite of all the strange evidence and circumstances, the case was essentially shut down. Officially, they said it was because of the absence of a guilty party. So, the overarching final conclusion was that the cause of death was an unknown, compelling force which the hikers were unable to overcome. Although authorities had an obvious desire to wrap up this case as quickly and as quietly as possible, members of the family, as well as independent researchers, would continue to pry into this case. And as the years passed by, theories, speculation and conspiracies would run increasingly rampant. Let's have a wee look at some of these theories. So, on the night of the Dyatlov Pass incident, numerous reports emerged of peculiar lights in the night sky over the mountain range where the group's torn tent was later discovered. These sightings have fueled speculation that the hikers might have encountered a UFO, potentially leading to their untimely deaths. The nature of some of these injuries, particularly those sustained by Dubinina, suggests that their deaths may not have been a simple accident, which just obviously deepens this mystery further. The broken branches of the tree where the first 2 bodies were found have also raised questions about whether they could have been damaged by an actual craft. The abrupt cessation of footsteps around the tree, leaving undisturbed snow, has led to speculation that the hikers might have been somehow scooped up and then maybe dropped on or around that tree. The separate discoveries of Dubinina and the second group of hikers, with 3 of them found frozen while apparently heading back to camp, have added to this mystery surrounding their potential encounter with something extraterrestrial. While most people dismiss the deaths as unrelated to supernatural phenomena or local legends, others have considered the possibility that the glowing orbs and strange activity on the mountain range might not necessarily be the result of any sort of alien intelligence, but rather a top secret region for military weapons testing. The glowing orbs witnessed by locals could have been linked to clandestine military activities, and the secluded location might have housed a secret military installation. The hikers' deaths could have been accidental or just a result of being in an off-limits area unintentionally. The actions of Zolotaryov and Brignol, who left the tent before the others, might have been related to these military operations, potentially prompting an extreme and efficient response. The Soviet authorities' secrecy and the injuries sustained by the second group of hikers, resembling those from a high-pressure impact, well, that further fuels these speculations. One intriguing theory revolves around the testing of a pulse or sonar weapon over the Ural Mountains. The internal injuries of the second group could have been caused by an unimaginable wave of energy, presenting the military with a dilemma. Either they admit their mistake or fabricate a scenario to deter further probing. This theory aligns with other potential cases involving exotic and lethal weapons testing. The Guaraparanga Reservoir Man case might be the best examples of such occurrences. So, in 1988 at the Guaraparanga Reservoir over in Brazil came the grim discovery of an unidentified man. He had injuries that were almost identical in nature to those found on mutilated cattle. Initial autopsy results indicated that he had been dead for several days at this point. However, there were little, if any, signs of decomposition anywhere in his body. The injuries inflicted were both horrifying and precise. The victim's body was completely drained of blood, with purposeful removal of skin samples across his entire body. Additionally, his tongue, eyes and ears were surgically removed. Despite the brutality of the crime, the man's identity still remains unknown, making this case one of the most chilling on record. 7 years earlier, in 1981, in the Panorama area of Brazil, a similar incident occurred. This time there was little doubt, at least according to the many witnesses, of a connection to a strange UFO sighting. The region was filled at that point with reports of unusual objects in the sky. Locals referred to these mysterious aerial phenomena as chupas, which would illuminate the ground below with strange searchlights. Abel Borrell would witness one of these crafts close up. Unfortunately for him, it was the last thing that he would see. Along with his friend Rivamar Ferreira, they noticed a spinning circular object hovering above them. In a matter of seconds, it zeroed in on Borrell and ejected a bright light that washed over his body. By the time Ferreira had returned with help, Borrell was dead. His body was devoid of every last drop of blood. Several theories surrounding the fate of the 9 hikers centre on secret missions for the KGB. During the time of the incident and the following 3 decades, the Soviet Union was locked in a tense standoff with the Western world, particularly with the United States, which closely monitored Soviet activities. This context of Cold War tensions has led some to speculate that the hikers may have been involved in some sort of covert operations for the KGB. So with that in mind, some theories suggest that several of the group were actually working for the KGB. Their mission was to plant radioactive clothing at the site to simply serve as a false trail for any Western intelligence services, with the hope being that they would divert funds and resources to investigating that, sort of like a distraction. Taking this a step further, Alexei Rakitin asserted in his book The Dyatlov Pass that Alexander Zolotaryov, along with 2 other members of the group, were actually KGB agents on a mission to uncover a CIA cell operating in the country. Rakitin went as far as to say that the CIA was ultimately responsible for the deaths of these 9 hikers. While there is little proof of the CIA's involvement in this incident, the involvement of the aforementioned Alexander Zolotaryov is rather interesting. Not only was he much older than the rest of the group, he had extensive military and combatant training. Furthermore, he had joined the group at the very last minute. Even stranger than that was a tattoo on his person which would read this: "So far, no translation into any language exists." We're going to come back to Zolotaryov just a bit later on. A more mundane suggestion is that the group fell victim to a sudden avalanche, forcing them to urgently evacuate their tent. However, this theory is highly unlikely, as there was no visible indications or aftermath of such an avalanche, and the experienced hikers were unlikely to set up camp in a dangerous area. Speculation also arose that the group may have fallen victim to one of the local tribes, particularly the Mansi tribe. However, the Mansies were known to be peaceful, and this theory fails to explain the absence of tracks or any other signs of an outside interference at the scene. Any blame placed on the Mansi tribes likely stemmed from an opportunistic desire of the wider Russian population to paint those they saw as heretics in bad light. More recently, theories surfaced suggesting that the hikers may have been attacked by something called a menk. This is a Siberian legend, similar to that of Bigfoot, but associated with supernatural elements and ancient astronaut theories. However, an attack from such a mythical creature seems pretty highly unlikely. The lack of tracks around the site makes an attack from local tribes or wild beasts fairly improbable. Additionally, while the second group sustained significant internal injuries, there were no external signs of shredding, cuts, or any lacerations that would be consistent with an animal attack on either group. Unless considering the Menk's supposed supernatural abilities, mind you, well, that wouldn't leave tracks, would it? A realistic animal attack scenario is difficult to support, given the evidence at the scene. The hikers' decision to cut their way out of the tent, which could have provided some form of protection against animals, well, that also raises doubts about how an animal encounter could have caused all this. However, there is a photo though that surfaced from the many developed from the group's recovered cameras that's certainly worth looking at. So one of these images recovered from Brignol's camera, often referred to as frame 17, has captured the attention of many researchers despite being dismissed by most folk. This picture offers a perspective from below a rise of the landscape, showing a pathway flanked by snow-covered trees. In the centre of the frame, there is a blurred yet unmistakable image of what looks like a humanoid figure. While it could easily just be a person, and to be fair, it's likely that it is, the shading of the figure appears to be consistent with the surrounding colour or material. Even the staunchest skeptic might acknowledge that the figure bears a resemblance to what many would recognise now as a Bigfoot type creature. Could it be the Russian Yeti, or this Menk creature? It's also clearly facing forward, as if walking back down the slope towards the cameraman. Incidentally, this was the last picture on Brignol's camera. Was this mysterious creature some kind of wild beast-like man or a Bigfoot? And was it responsible, one way or another, for the deaths of all these 9 hikers? Detractors of these claims argue that a trail leading away from the photographer is clearly visible in the picture. This suggests that whoever this mystery figure is likely just one of the hikers. It's probable that they just walked away from the cameraman, possibly to get a better view of their surroundings. At that moment, then, the photo was taken, and then they were likely in the process of coming back down the hill towards Brignol. What's intriguing is Zolotaryov's camera, which was still around his neck at the time his body was found. But even more peculiar than that though, is the fact that this camera, well, that was different from the one that he had been using the entire time throughout the journey. That one was discovered amongst the remnants of the tent. Why had he changed cameras? Could this be another indication of some sort of secret clandestine mission? Whatever the reason is, the 11 pictures that he captured were mysterious and, to be honest, slightly chilling. While none of them were really clear, they show strange flashes, bizarre manifestations, and perhaps most intriguing, glowing orbs. These pictures, and the events leading up to them, would seem to be of obvious importance. Why did Zolotaryov and Brignol leave the tent in the dark, freezing conditions? Why did Zolotaryov feel the need to take a camera with him at that point, and why take a different one from the one that he had been using? One of the most intriguing and scientifically grounded theories comes from a professor called Yermyarchenko, who posited that the hikers were victims of gravity fluctuations. So he suggests a significant external pressure ejected them from the tent due to gravity corridors forming in these valleys. The internal tent damage could be explained by higher air pressure inside, propelling the hikers through the material. This theory accounts for the severe internal injuries of those outside the tent during the incident. Yerchenko's gravity fluctuation theory could also explain why the hikers were found quite far away from the campsite, in peculiar positions, as if trying to escape the perceived gravity corridor. Those outside may have died instantly, while the remaining members hovered briefly before succumbing. Despite the widespread interest in the case and the numerous investigations, both official and unofficial, the events that unfolded in the harsh, freezing conditions of the Ural Mountains in early February of 1959, well, they still remain shrouded in mystery. And it's a particularly eerie mystery. The theory of an avalanche causing the deaths of the hikers seems improbable for several reasons. Not only is there a lack of evidence supporting an avalanche, but it fails to explain a myriad of peculiar details. For instance, why were the bodies found in such odd positions and divided into two groups? What about the damage to that tree and the remnants of a fire near where the first two bodies were discovered? Even if there was some sort of perceived threat, it's unlikely that it would have sparked a panic leading to the demise of the entire group. So let's begin by dismissing what is perhaps the least probable scenario among them all, that the hikers met their tragic fate at the hands of Bigfoot. So what about the UFO claims? There have been numerous reports of strange lights in the vicinity of that mountain range. However, the primary reason for the UFO speculation, in this case, well, it stems from the peculiar and precise facial injuries suffered by the hikers, particularly the removal of skin tissue. At first glance, the incident seems like a classic UFO encounter, and has certainly remained within the UFO discourse, especially since the story gained wider attention worldwide following the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, there might be a more grounded, albeit equally unsettling, explanation. There are speculations of a clandestine military connection, with the hikers potentially stumbling onto a restricted territory, or being guided off course, possibly by Zolotaryov if his rumoured intelligence ties are accurate. Zolotaryov and Brignol may have ventured out to investigate some sort of activity, explaining their extra layers of clothing. The extensive internal injuries of the second group suggest that they were in closer proximity to whatever was being tested or experienced near that ravine. The series of events points towards a disastrous military or otherworldly incident that the hikers inadvertently witnessed. If these deaths were indeed the result of a secret military testing, could the real conspiracy here then be the subsequent cover-up of their actions? And not just upon the discovery of the bodies, but perhaps even before that. It's plausible that the military, upon realising their mistake, deliberately manipulated the scene, including the positioning of the bodies and their final locations. There is some discrepancies regarding whether the tent had actually been set up correctly. These hikers were super experienced in harsh conditions, making it highly unlikely for them to overlook such a basic yet essential procedure. Was the tent hastily reassembled then by someone, possibly by inexperienced military personnel, in an attempt to conceal events that still remain shrouded in mystery? Was it indeed a cover-up? Was the situation so dire that there was a perceived need to shield it from the potential scrutiny of the outside world? The prevailing theory is not that an avalanche in the broadest terms was to blame. Something called a delayed slab avalanche, as the name suggests. This just means that the activity at the base of a slanted snow shelf could have caused a section of this slab to break off and essentially slide right down and into the camp.
Big blocks on your ribs, it can really lead to serious injuries.
The slab avalanche did not happen immediately after the cut. There was a significant delay. Dyatlov group cut the slope and installed the tent, and meanwhile outside, strong katabatic winds were transporting snow, which accumulated due to the special topography just above the tent, loading the slab until eventually the weak layer below the slab loses its strength and the slab released.
But then, that doesn't really explain all the other weird stuff. There remains hope that somewhere in a vault in Russia, explanations await. Perhaps deep below the modern cities, in a building once utilised during the Cold War era, maybe there sits a file with the real story of the Dyatlov Pass incident. Until that day, there remains only theories and speculations. The findings of those who still, over half a century later, have a grim fascination with this dark event, an event that perhaps we should keep in mind, resulted in the very real deaths of 9 very real people. Well, that's it for this video, folks. If you've made it to this point, I just want to thank you for sticking with me. I don't know about you, but I'm away for a cup of tea. Please stay safe out there, tell someone that you love them, and no matter what, remember, keep smiling.